Ever feel like going through the audit process is kind of like checking your rearview mirror, but you're doing 80 on the highway?
Yeah, I know what you
You're
mean.
looking for problems that are already in the past.
Right, trying to fix something after it's happened.
Well, buckle up because we're diving deep into QC 1000 today, and this new standard is all about making audits way more proactive.
Yeah, it's about time.
It really is. So, for anyone who's new to this whole thing, what exactly is QC 1000?
So QC 1000 is basically a new set of rules, a quality control standard
Mm-hmm.
that the PCAOB put together.
Hmm.
They're the ones who oversee all the audits of public companies.
Right, the ones making sure everything's on the up and up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is a pretty big deal. I mean, we're talking about the biggest shakeup the auditing world has seen in decades.
Wow, decades. So, when does this whole thing actually take effect?
It's on the calendar for December 15th, 2025.
2025, got it. That's good to know. But why now? Why the sudden urge to change everything?
Well, the PCAOB, they did some digging and found that almost half of the audits they looked at in 2023 just weren't cutting it.
Really? Half?
Yeah, which is a pretty scary thought when you think about it.
It's a little terrifying, honestly, if you compare it to, like, finding out the brakes on your car only work half the time.
That's a good analogy. And it screams like, time for a major overhaul. That's where QC 1000 comes in. It's all about boosting that audit quality, putting a laser focus on managing risk, making sure everyone's accountable.
And I'm guessing technology plays a role in all of this.
Absolutely. Using tech to make the whole process smoother, more efficient, and way more effective.
Okay, so it's like we're swapping out our old clunky audit system for something sleek and modern, something with all the latest bells and whistles.
Yeah, think of it like a system upgrade.
I like that. So talk to me about some of these new features, the things that make QC 1000 different.
One of the biggest changes. They're switching to something called a risk-based approach.
Risk-based approach. That sounds interesting, but can you unpack that for me? What does that actually look like in the real world?
Sure. In the past, a lot of audits, they kind of just followed this standard playbook.
A one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. But the thing is, that wasn't always the best way to find problems before they became a big issue. A risk-based approach, though, that means auditors are tailoring their approach based on the specific risks of each company.
So instead of giving every patient the same general checkup, they're looking at your medical history and saying, okay, we need to focus on this area specifically.
Exactly. Let's say your company leans heavily on a really complicated global supply chain. Well, a risk-based approach means auditors will be spending more time on that.
Makes sense.
They'll dig deep into your inventory, your supplier contracts, that sort of thing.
So they're really zeroing in on the areas where things could go wrong.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about being more strategic, more targeted, and making sure they're using their resources in the best way possible. And it's not just about spotting those risks, it's about making sure that someone is actually doing something about them.
Okay, so how does QC 1000 make sure those risks are actually being managed? What's built into this new standard that keeps everyone on their toes?
Well, one thing is that now these firms, they have to do these annual checkups.
Checkups, like on themselves.
Yeah, they have to evaluate their own quality control systems.
Interesting.
It's about taking a step back, looking at the big picture, and figuring out, are the systems we have in place actually working the way they should?
Right, because what's the point of auditing other companies if your own house is a mess?
Exactly. Are there any gaps? Are there any weak spots that need to be, tightened up? That kind of thing.
So it's like this built-in system of checks and balances, but it's happening within the audit firm itself.
Yeah, you got it.
They're not just auditing other companies, they're auditing their own internal processes.
Exactly. And QC 1000 takes it a step further.
Oh, how so?
It puts the responsibility for quality control squarely on the CEO of the audit firm.
Wow, they put the CEO in charge of quality control.
Yep, the buck stops there.
That's a pretty bold move. It shows they're really serious about making some changes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They are. And for the bigger firms, the ones working with like more than 100 companies each year, they've got another layer to deal with. They have to set up something called an EQCF.
EQCF. Okay, now you're just using acronyms to make me feel lost. Break that down for me. What is an EQCF?
Basically, it's a separate independent team,
Okay.
and their whole job is to double check everyone's work. They review audits. They look at the methods being used, the whole 9 yards.
You're like the audit police.
Yeah, kind of. Making sure everyone is playing by the rules and that things are up to the highest standards.
Got it. So with all these new rules and these safeguards, QC 1000, it's Gotta have a pretty big impact on businesses, especially when you're talking about financial reporting.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
What are some of the good things that companies can expect to see from all of this?
Well, the most obvious one is that the quality of the audits should get a boost. And that naturally leads to financial reports that companies can trust.
Right, because accurate information is key.
It's crucial, especially for investors, lenders, anyone who relies on those numbers to make decisions. But it goes beyond just making sure the numbers add up.
What else does it do?
It's about giving a much clearer picture of how healthy a company's finances really are.
So, no more getting caught off guard by some hidden financial issue buried in a footnote.
Exactly.
You'll have a much better grasp of where things stand.
Yes, exactly. And that kind of transparency, it's more valuable than ever, especially with how quickly things can change in the business world these days.
You mentioned earlier that QC 1000 is pushing the audit world into the digital age. What's the deal with that? Tell me more about how they're using technology to up their game.
This is the fun part. We're talking about AI, artificial intelligence,
Oh, wow.
and automation
Interesting.
to make audits more efficient, more accurate, you name it.
Give me an example. How are they actually using it?
Imagine for a second these AI programs, they're sifting through these mountains of data.
Okay.
They're
Yeah.
picking up on these little details, these patterns that might point to something fishy going on.
So instead of someone spending hours and hours poring over spreadsheets, you've got AI doing it in a fraction of the time.
Yes. And it can do it without getting bored or missing something. And it frees up the auditors to look at the bigger picture, the more complex stuff.
It's like they're becoming financial detectives.
In a way, yeah. They
Yeah.
can focus on strategy, on really digging deep into the areas that need that extra attention.
It sounds like it's a win-win. Companies get a better audit, and auditors can actually focus on, like you said, the more complex strategic work.
Right.
But we've talked about the good. What about the not so good? Are there any downsides to QC 1000 that companies need to be aware of?
Well, one thing that people are worried about is that this is all going to come with a bigger price tag.
That makes sense. You're implementing all these changes, new tech. It's got to cost something.
It does. And those costs, they're probably going to get passed down to the clients at some point. Bigger companies, they could probably handle it. But for smaller companies, mid-market companies, the ones who are just starting out.
Yeah, those companies usually don't have a ton of cash lying around.
Exactly. It could be tough. And it's not just the audit itself. They might have trouble finding auditors who are actually ready for all this new stuff,
Yeah.
especially because,
Especially.
well, the smaller firms, they might not be able to adapt as quickly.
So there are definitely some pros and cons for companies to think about. And it sounds like those smaller companies, they might have some extra hurdles to clear.
Yeah, and that's actually sparked a bit of controversy around this whole QC 1000 thing. Not everyone's convinced it's the right move, at least not how it is now.
Really? Who's pushing back and what are they saying?
Well, even within the SEC, there's been some disagreement. Commissioner Pierce, for example, she's worried about how quickly they're trying to roll this whole thing out.
Mm-hmm.
She's saying that some parts of it might need a second look, especially with how it could impact those smaller firms we're talking about.
Right.
And then there's Commissioner Ieda. He's mentioned that maybe they should have given people more time to voice their opinions before they made it official.
So even within the SEC, there's not total agreement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is a big change, so it makes sense that they'd want to be careful.
Who else is raising concerns?
The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been pretty vocal. They're not happy about it.
That's a pretty powerful group. What's got them so fired up?
Well, their biggest issue, and it's something that others have brought up too, is how this EQCF is going to affect those smaller audit firms.
Mm.
They're saying that putting that into practice, keeping it running, it's going to be super expensive.
Okay.
And for smaller firms, that could be a huge burden.
It could make it really tough for them to compete.
Yeah. And if those smaller firms get squeezed out, it could mean less choice, maybe even higher costs for companies in the long run.
Especially those mid-market and emerging companies.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's tricky, you know? There are good arguments on both sides. It's really about finding that sweet spot.
Right. Where you're improving things, but not creating a whole bunch of new problems at the same time.
Exactly.
It seems like no matter what side of the fence you're on with this, everyone can agree that this is a big moment for the auditing world. But let's zoom out for a second. Forget the technical stuff and the arguments. What does QC 1000 really say about where auditing is headed in the future?
That's a great question. To me, QC 1000, it shows you how important trust really is, especially when it comes to finances.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen those accounting scandals. We've heard people question if audits can be trusted. This new standard, It's about rebuilding that trust.
It's about making sure that when someone sees a financial report, they know they can count on it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And that it's been thoroughly checked. There might be some bumps in the road as everyone figures out this new system.
It's like learning how to drive a new car. It takes a little time to get used to it.
Yeah. But ultimately, it's about making the whole system stronger, making it more reliable.
That's something we can all get behind.
Definitely.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into QC 1000. We've covered a lot of ground today. I'll leave you with this as you're navigating this new world of auditing, with its focus on risk, on tech, on accountability. Think about how these ideas could apply to your business in other ways, not just in the finance department, but in every aspect of your company.